The car ride to Harrington House was uneventful, but the tension in my chest had been building steadily since Elliot had first shown me the letter from the Duval family. As a history teacher, I've always had a fascination with the past, particularly with the myths and folklore that tie humanity to the supernatural. But there's a stark difference between studying these stories in dusty textbooks and walking into the heart of one that's still unfolding. The house stood at the crest of a hill, its silhouette framed by skeletal trees twisted like arthritic fingers. The mansion was massive, its colonial architecture showing years of neglect. Its broken windows glinted faintly in the moonlight, almost like malevolent eyes watching our approach. A cold shiver ran down my spine as Elliot parked the car. He stepped out, his long coat rippling in the wind, and began walking toward the looming structure without hesitation. I lagged behind, unsure if my hesitation was born of fear or instinct. The wind carried with it a low, mournful sound, as though the trees themselves were lamenting our arrival. "Elliot," I called after him, "this place feels wrong." He turned briefly, his piercing gaze locking onto mine. "It's not supposed to feel right, Miguel," he replied with a tone both pragmatic and unyielding. "People don't call us when things are normal." The front porch groaned under our weight as we ascended the creaking wooden steps. The door loomed before us, its peeling paint and rusting hinges a testament to years of abandonment. Elliot knocked, his fist rapping sharply against the wood. The sound echoed briefly and was swallowed by an unnatural silence. The door opened slowly, revealing Mr. Duval. He was a wiry man, his pale face marked by deep lines of worry, and his posture carried a weight as if he had aged decades in mere weeks. Behind him stood his wife, clutching their young daughter tightly to her side. Their son, a teenager who looked like he was trying to mask his fear with defiance, hovered near his mother but kept his gaze fixed on the floor. "Mr. Brooks," Duval greeted hesitantly. "And you must be his assistant?" His eyes flicked toward me, but there was no warmth in his tone. I smiled briefly, though the atmosphere did little to inspire friendliness. "Miguel Vasquez," I said, "history teacher and researcher, at your service." Elliot wasted no time. "Tell me what's been happening." His voice was commanding, cutting through the oppressive air like a knife. Duval's gaze darted around the room as though he feared the shadows themselves might overhear. "It's the noises. At first, just faint whispers. You think it's the wind or the creaks of the old wood. But then they become clearer, louder, until you can't ignore them anymore." His wife interrupted, her voice tight with fear. "And the chime. It rings at the oddest hours like it's warning us or calling to someone. We hear it most at night." The little girl whimpered, burying her face in her mother's skirt. Her brother stiffened, his jaw clenching as though he resented showing any vulnerability. Duval gestured for us to follow, leading us into the heart of the house. The moment I stepped over the threshold, the atmosphere shifted. It was as though the air itself were thicker, heavier. Every step felt deliberate, even the smallest sound echoing unnaturally. My hand instinctively brushed against the wall, where the wallpaper hung in curling strips. The patterns once painted on its surface were barely discernible, faded by time and neglect. We ascended the staircase, the wooden steps groaning underfoot. The hallway above stretched into darkness, the dim glow of a single flickering bulb doing little to dispel the shadows. Duval led us to one of the rooms at the end of the corridor. "This is where we hear it the most," he whispered. Elliot strode ahead, scanning the room with meticulous precision. It was sparsely furnished. A bed, a wardrobe, a broken chair, and yet it was the atmosphere that demanded attention. There was something suffocating about the space, a weight in the air that pressed against my chest. "Elliot," I began, but the sound of a chime interrupted me. It was faint but unmistakable, its metallic melody somehow discordant, as though the instrument resented being played. The sound didn't come from any direction. It surrounded us, filling the space with its eerie cadence. "Below," Elliot said, his voice clipped. "It's coming from below." The descent into the basement felt like an act of defiance against every instinct screaming at me to turn and run. The narrow stairs spiraled into darkness, the walls slick with condensation that glistened like veins of silver. The flashlight in Elliot's hand created a shifting tunnel of light, illuminating stone walls that seemed to close in tighter the deeper we went. At the base of the stairs, the room opened into a space that felt impossibly large, as though the basement stretched beyond the dimensions of the house above. Crates and rusted tools lay scattered, their forgotten presence a testament to decades of disuse. In the far corner, Elliot's light caught something etched into the stone. A series of symbols jagged and crude, their edges sharp as knives. I stepped closer, my pulse quickening as the markings stirred a familiarity deep within me. "These are ritualistic," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Colonial symbols tied to summoning. Harrington's experiments, they started here." Elliot crouched, tracing the markings with his gloved hand. "And the chime, likely tied to these rites," I replied, though even as the words left my mouth, I doubted their sufficiency to explain the unnatural presence saturating the air. The sound of the chime came again, louder this time. It wasn't merely a sound. It was a command, a call to something unseen. The shadows seemed to shift as though responding to the chime's melody. My breath hitched as Elliot's flashlight flickered, casting the room into momentary darkness. When the light stabilized, Elliot stood, his expression grim. "This house is haunted," he said simply, "and it's not going to let us leave until we've finished what it started." The cold air in the basement clung to my skin, sharp and unforgiving. The weight of the atmosphere seemed to intensify as Elliot and I moved through the labyrinth of stone and shadows. His flashlight cut through the oppressive darkness, revealing forgotten crates, rusted tools, and cobwebs stretched like decayed lace across the beams. Each step we took sent faint echoes up the stairs, a hollow sound that hinted at the vast emptiness below Harrington House. "You hear it again, don't you?" Elliot's voice was calm, almost detached, but I caught the slightest edge of tension in it. He paused, tilting his head to listen. The chime rang faintly, a cold, metallic note that seemed to vibrate through the air itself. It wasn't a melody. It lacked rhythm, harmony, or intent, but there was a haunting quality to it, as though the sound itself was alive and aware of us. I nodded, not trusting my voice to remain steady, and followed as Elliot pressed further into the basement's recesses. The walls were lined with strange carvings, jagged symbols etched unevenly into the stone. Many were faded with age, barely visible under the thin layer of grime and dust, but their presence was undeniable. I traced one of the symbols lightly with my gloved hand, feeling its roughness against my fingertips. "These markings," I said quietly, "they're older than I expected. Reverend Harrington didn't create this. He was building on something already here." Elliot crouched by one of the walls, his flashlight focusing on a particularly deep carving. "The Duvals didn't mention anything about this," he murmured. more to himself than to me. If these predate the house, then whatever's happening here might not have started with Harrington's rituals. A loud creak came from the wooden beams above us, startling me. Elliot barely flinched, his eyes remaining fixed on the symbols. I envied his composure, though I couldn't help but wonder if it was a practiced calm masking his own unease. After all, how many times had we faced the unexplainable together? Too many, and yet never enough to make it routine. The chime rang out again, louder this time. It reverberated through the room, making the very air around us hum with an unnatural energy. I instinctively took a step closer to Elliot, my pulse quickening. "It's coming from further back," he said, his voice steady. "We're not alone down here." The thought chilled me to my core, but I nodded, following closely as he led the way deeper into the basement. The flashlight illuminated a narrow passageway partially blocked by debris, splintered wood, loose bricks, and ancient, rusted nails. It looked as though part of the wall had collapsed long ago, revealing a space beyond that wasn't part of the original basement. Elliot slipped through the narrow gap with the practiced ease of someone who had spent his life chasing the unknown. While I hesitated for a moment, my mind racing with images of what might await us on the other side. When I finally pushed through, I found myself in a smaller, circular chamber. The walls here were smoother, almost polished, and the carvings were more intricate. At the center of the room stood a pedestal of blackened stone, its surface cracked and worn. On it rested an object wrapped in what looked like weathered burlap, tied neatly with a length of rotted cord. The faint sound of the chime seemed to emanate from the very air around the pedestal, as if the object had drawn the sound to itself. Elliot moved cautiously toward the pedestal, his flashlight illuminating the scene with a cold, white light. He crouched, studying the wrapped object without touching it. "This must be it," he said, his voice low. "The source of the chime." I kept my distance, the weight of the room pressing heavily on my chest. "Should we open it?" Elliot gave me a sharp look, his brows furrowed. "Not yet. We don't know what we're dealing with." My eyes were drawn to the carvings on the pedestal itself. Unlike the symbols on the walls, these were more elaborate, almost artistic in their design. I traced one with my finger, feeling a faint vibration beneath the stone, as though the pedestal itself were alive. "These carvings," I said, my voice trembling slightly, "they're not colonial. They're older, much older. If Harrington found this and tried to use it..." Elliot cut me off with a gesture, his body suddenly tense. He stood slowly, his hand resting on the holstered pistol at his side. "We're not alone," he said quietly, his eyes scanning the room. My heart raced as I followed his gaze, the shadows around us seeming to shift and writhe in the flickering light. A cold draft swept through the room, extinguishing the feeble glow of my flashlight. I fumbled with it, my fingers trembling, but the beam refused to return. Elliot's light remained steady, though it seemed weaker than before, as though the darkness itself were consuming it. A low whisper filled the chamber, a sound so faint I almost thought I imagined it, but it grew steadily louder until it became a chorus of voices, each distinct yet blending together into an incoherent cacophony. The shadows on the walls lengthened and moved, taking on shapes that shouldn't have been possible. Figures with too many limbs, faces that twisted and melted into one another. Elliot backed away from the pedestal, his movements deliberate and measured. "Miguel," he said, his voice steady but urgent. "We need to leave. Now." I didn't argue. As I turned to follow him, the chime rang again, louder than ever, and the whispers reached a crescendo. The room seemed to shift around us, the walls bending and twisting as though the very fabric of reality were unraveling. I felt a cold hand grip my arm, and I yanked myself free, stumbling after Elliot as he led us back through the narrow passageway. The basement seemed different as we retraced our steps. The walls felt closer, the air thicker. My breathing grew shallow, and I struggled to keep up with Elliot's pace. The sound of the chime followed us, relentless and mocking, as though it were chasing us out. When we finally emerged back into the main basement chamber, I collapsed against the wall, my chest heaving as I tried to catch my breath. Elliot stood nearby, his flashlight scanning the room for any sign of movement. The whispers had stopped, but the oppressive silence that replaced them was almost worse. What the hell was that? I managed to gasp, my voice shaky. Elliot didn't answer immediately. He was focused on the narrow passageway, his eyes narrowed as though he expected something, or someone, to emerge from the darkness. After a long moment, he turned to me, his expression grim. "We're in over our heads," he said simply. "Whatever's down here, it's not just history, it's alive." The weight of his words settled over me like a lead blanket, and I found myself unable to argue. Harrington House was more than just a relic of the past. It was a gateway, a place where the lines between the natural and the supernatural blurred, and we were standing right in the middle of it. For the first time since we'd arrived, I felt the full weight of the danger we were in. The chime wasn't just a sound. It was a warning, a call to something far beyond our understanding, and it wasn't going to let us go without a fight. The heavy air of the basement clung to me like a damp shroud as we staggered into the main chamber, still reeling from the unnerving encounter deeper within the house. My breaths came shallow and quick, each one fighting against the oppressive atmosphere that seemed to press down harder with each passing moment. Elliot's flashlight beam swept methodically across the room, but even its stark illumination couldn't drive away the sense of unseen eyes watching from the shadows. "We need answers, and fast," Elliot muttered, his tone clipped but composed. He adjusted his fedora, the subtle shift of his jawline betraying the tension he wasn't willing to admit outright. "Whatever's tied to this place, it's drawing power from something, and it won't stop until we figure out what that is." I nodded, though my throat felt dry and tight. The chime's haunting melody still echoed faintly in my ears, like a ghostly refrain that refused to let go. "Those markings on the wall," I ventured, my voice shaking slightly as I gestured toward the crude symbols carved into the stone. "They weren't just warnings, they were part of a ritual. Harrington didn't create the curse. He unleashed it, and now it's feeding on this family." Elliot glanced at me, his steel blue eyes sharp and calculating. "We need to go back upstairs," he said, already turning toward the stairwell. "There's more to this story, and I'd wager it's written somewhere in this house." I followed him, though every fiber of my being urged me to flee. The creaking stairs groaned beneath our weight as we ascended, each step carrying us closer to the unknown horrors waiting above. The Duval family had retreated to the safety, or what they imagined as safety, of their living room, huddled together on the worn sofa like survivors of a shipwreck clinging to a fragile lifeboat. Mrs. Duval's face was pale and drawn, her eyes darting nervously between us and the flickering shadows that danced along the edges of the room. "Did you find it?" she asked, her voice trembling. "The thing making the sound?" "Not yet," Elliot replied, his tone measured. He stepped closer, his presence commanding but not unkind. "But I need to ask, did your family find anything unusual when you moved in?" Something old? Something hidden? Mr. Duval hesitated, his thin frame rigid with tension. We didn't go digging around, he stammered, his gaze shifting toward the floor. This house was cheap because of its history. We knew about the Reverend, but we never thought any of it was real. Real enough, Elliot said curtly. Think carefully. Did you disturb anything? An object, a relic. The room fell silent, save for the faint crackle of the fire struggling to burn in the hearth. The youngest Duval, a wide-eyed girl clutching a worn teddy bear, spoke up in a hesitant whisper. "The box," she said, her voice barely audible. "In the attic." Mrs. Duval turned sharply toward her daughter. "What are you talking about?" she demanded, though her voice quavered with fear. "The box with the pictures," the girl continued, her small hands clutching the bear tightly. "It had the man's face on it, the scary man." Elliot's expression darkened, and he turned to me. "The attic," he said simply, and I nodded. The climb to the topmost floor felt longer than it should have. The house groaned around us, its ancient timbers protesting every shift of weight. The air grew colder the higher we went, the chill sinking into my bones and making my breath fog in the dim light. By the time we reached the attic door, my heart was pounding as loudly as the footsteps that had carried us here. Elliot pushed the door open, revealing a cavernous space filled with the detritus of centuries. Broken furniture, faded trunks, and forgotten memories lay scattered beneath a thick layer of dust. The narrow beams of our flashlights cut through the gloom, casting eerie shadows that danced and shifted like phantoms. "Spread out," Elliot ordered, his voice low. "Look for anything that doesn't belong." We moved carefully, our footsteps muffled by the soft layer of dust that covered the floorboards. My flashlight beam settled on an old steamer trunk, its brass fittings tarnished and its leather straps frayed with age. Something about it felt out of place, as though it were waiting to be found. I knelt beside the trunk, brushing away the dust to reveal a set of initials burned into the leather. Sage. My pulse quickened as I realized what I'd found. "Elliot," I called, my voice barely steady. "I think you'll want to see this." He was by my side in an instant, his flashlight illuminating the trunk. He examined the initials, his jaw tightening. "Samuel Harrington," he said grimly. "Open it." I hesitated for only a moment before undoing the rusted clasps and lifting the lid. The stale air inside smelled of decay and secrets long buried. Inside, I found a collection of yellowed papers, brittle with age, and a blackened iron bell nestled among them. The bell was small and unassuming, but its surface was etched with the same strange symbols we'd seen in the basement. Elliot reached in, carefully lifting the bell from its resting place. The moment his fingers touched it, the temperature in the room plummeted, and the faint sound of the chime echoed once more, though neither of us had rung it. "This is it," he said quietly, his voice heavy with certainty. The chime. Before I could respond, a sudden gust of wind howled through the attic, extinguishing our flashlights and plunging us into darkness. I stumbled backward, my breath hitching as the shadows came alive around us. Whispers filled the air, growing louder and more insistent, their words unintelligible but undeniably angry. "Stay close," Elliot shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. I fumbled for his arm, gripping it tightly as the room seemed to warp around us. The whispers grew into a deafening roar, and the shadows coalesced into shapes, twisted figures with hollow eyes and mouths that gaped open in silent screams. The chime rang out, louder than ever, and the figures froze, their forms flickering like candle flames caught in a gust. Elliot tightened his grip on the bell, his jaw set with determination. "We're leaving," he said firmly, and together we stumbled toward the attic door. The descent to the main floor was a blur of motion and terror. By the time we reached the living room, the Duvals were on their feet, their faces pale with fear. "What's happening?" Mr. Duval demanded, his voice shaking. "We found it," Elliot said simply, holding up the bell. "And now we need to figure out how to stop it." The weight of silence in the living room was unbearable, punctuated only by the soft creaking of the old house as it settled into the cold night. Elliot stood by the fireplace, the bell clutched in his gloved hand as if he expected it to spring to life at any moment. Its blackened surface seemed to absorb the flickering firelight, its faint etchings catching only the occasional spark. I remained seated on the edge of a frayed armchair, the musty smell of worn fabric doing little to mask my growing unease. The Duvals huddled together on the sofa, their eyes darting between us and the darkened corners of the room. The youngest, clutching her teddy bear as though it were the only anchor in a storm, kept glancing toward the staircase that led to the second floor. Her small voice echoed in my mind, "The scary man," and I couldn't shake the feeling that her simple, childish words carried more truth than any of us wanted to admit. Elliot finally broke the silence, his voice low but firm. "This bell," he began, turning it over in his hands, "is no ordinary object. It's tied to something much older than this house, something Reverend Harrington likely didn't understand when he found it. And yet he used it," I added, leaning forward as the tension in my chest grew heavier. "He must have believed it could bring back what he lost. Or he was desperate enough to try," Elliot replied grimly, his gaze shifting to meet mine. "But whatever he summoned wasn't his wife or his daughter. This bell opened a door, and something stepped through." The words hung in the air like a sentence handed down by an unforgiving judge. The Duvals exchanged uneasy glances, their faces pale and drawn. What do you mean, something?" Mr. Duval stammered, his voice trembling. Elliot didn't answer immediately. He set the bell down on the mantelpiece, its placement feeling oddly deliberate, almost ritualistic. Then he turned to face the family, his expression both somber and resolute. "I mean, this house is a nexus, a place where the boundaries between our world and whatever lies beyond are dangerously thin. The rituals Harrington performed didn't just call to the dead, they disrupted the natural order. And now, the echoes of what he unleashed are still here, feeding on the living." Mrs. Duval clutched her daughter tightly, her knuckles white as she whispered a prayer under her breath. Her son, standing stiffly by her side, looked as though he wanted to bolt from the room but couldn't bring himself to move. The youngest, perhaps sensing the rising fear in the room, spoke up again in her small, trembling voice. "It doesn't like us here," she said, her wide eyes locking onto Elliot's. "It wants us to leave." "Smart kid," Elliot muttered, almost to himself. He turned back to the fireplace, his shoulders tense. "But we're not leaving. Not yet." He gestured for me to follow as he moved toward the hallway that led to the study. I hesitated, glancing back at the family. "Stay here," I said, trying to sound reassuring. "We'll figure this out." The study was a dim, claustrophobic space, its walls lined with shelves crammed full of old books and papers. The air was thick with the scent of aged leather and mildew, the faint rustle of our movements stirring up a layer of dust that clung to everything. Elliot began methodically rifling through the clutter, his movements precise and deliberate. "What are we looking for?" I asked, though I already had a sinking suspicion. "Anything that might tell us what Harrington was trying to do," Elliot replied without looking up. "Books, notes, journal entries. There's always a trail." I nodded and began sifting through a pile of papers on the desk. Most were illegible. The ink faded with time, but a few fragments stood out. Mentions of rituals, references to ancient texts, sketches of symbols similar to those we'd seen in the basement. Each piece felt like a puzzle fragment, tantalizing but incomplete. "Here," Elliot said suddenly, pulling a weathered leather-bound journal from the bottom shelf. He flipped through the pages quickly, his eyes scanning the cramped, spidery handwriting. "It's Harrington's personal diary," he murmured, his tone tinged with both excitement and dread. I moved closer, peering over his shoulder as he read aloud. The entries were erratic, filled with the ramblings of a man teetering on the edge of sanity. Harrington wrote of his grief, his desperation to reunite with his family, and his growing obsession with the bell, the chime, as he called it. He described it as both a gift and a curse, a tool capable of piercing the veil between worlds but at great cost. One passage in particular caught my attention. "The chime answers my call, but its song is no comfort. It echoes with the voices of the forgotten, the lost, and the angry. They whisper promises of reunion, but their touch is cold and cruel. I see her face, my dear Eleanor, but it is a mask, a shadow of what she was. The chime has brought me closer to the truth, but it has also brought something else. I fear what I have awakened will not be sated." The words sent a chill through me, and I stepped back, running a hand through my hair as I tried to process what I just heard. "He knew," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "He knew the danger, and he kept going." Elliot nodded, his jaw set tightly. "Grief makes people do desperate things." Before I could respond, the sound of the chime rang out again, louder and clearer than ever. It reverberated through the house, shaking the walls and rattling the books on their shelves. I exchanged a panicked glance with Elliot, who was already moving toward the door, his hand resting on the bell clipped to his belt. We returned to the living room to find the Duvals in a state of panic. The youngest was crying, her mother holding her tightly while her brother shouted over the noise, trying to be heard. Mr. Duval stood frozen in place, his eyes fixed on the staircase. "It's here," he said hoarsely, pointing toward the darkened hallway that led to the bedrooms. "It's coming for us." Elliot stepped forward, his voice cutting through the chaos with calm authority. "Get everyone outside," he instructed. "Now." Mr. Duval hesitated for only a moment before nodding. He ushered his family toward the front door, their footsteps quick and unsteady as they fled into the cold night. I stayed behind, my heart pounding as I followed Elliot into the hallway. The shadows seemed to writhe and twist, moving unnaturally as the chime's haunting melody grew louder. The air was heavy with an electric charge, and every instinct screamed at me to run. But I stayed close to Elliot, his presence a steady anchor in the storm. We reached the end of the hallway, where the door to one of the bedrooms stood ajar. The chime's sound was deafening now, filling the space with a terrible resonance that seemed to seep into my very bones. Elliot pushed the door open, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. The room was empty, save for a single figure standing in the corner, a shadowy silhouette that seemed to waver like smoke caught in a breeze. It turned toward us slowly, its hollow eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. The chime fell silent, replaced by a low, guttural whisper that sent shivers down my spine. Elliot stepped forward, his voice steady but firm. "We know what you are," he said, holding the bell up like a talisman. "And we're not afraid of you." I wished I could say the same, but my body betrayed me, trembling as the figure began to move toward us. It raised one hand, a skeletal appendage that seemed to stretch impossibly long as it reached for the bell. And then the chime rang again. The chime's resonance reverberated through the walls of the house, a dreadful vibration that didn't just fill the air. It seemed to enter your bones, worming its way into the very core of your thoughts. My flashlight beam quivered as the tremor in my hand betrayed the fear I was working so hard to suppress. The figure in the corner of the bedroom stood unmoving now, as though frozen in place, yet it exuded a malevolence so palpable that it was hard to draw breath. Elliot moved ahead, his body tense, the worn leather of his boots creaking with each deliberate step. The brass bell he carried glinted faintly in the dim light, its carved symbols mocking in their stillness. He held it in a firm grip, his posture revealing both his wariness and his determination. "We need to drive it back," he said, his voice low but resolute, as if trying to speak without alerting the thing that watched us from across the yard. "What if we can't?" The words slipped from my lips before I could stop them, and I cursed the weakness in my own voice. Elliot glanced back at me briefly, his expression inscrutable in the flickering light. "We can," he said simply, but there was a weight to his words that made me think he was trying to convince himself as much as me. I stood rooted to the spot, unable to peel my eyes away from the silhouette in the corner. It was tall, almost impossibly so, and its edges flickered and shifted like smoke caught in a draft. Its head tilted slightly, as if it were studying us with an intelligence that sent a shiver racing down my spine. Then, without warning, it moved. The motion was fluid yet unnatural, a glide rather than a step, and I instinctively stepped back, nearly tripping over a loose floorboard. Elliot didn't flinch, his gaze locked onto the figure as it approached. He raised the bell slightly, and the chime rang out of its own accord, soft at first, then growing in intensity, as though the sound itself were rallying against the entity before us. The creature stopped, its outline pulsing faintly with each tone of the bell. I could feel the vibrations in the air, each note a physical force pressing against my chest. The whispers began again, faint and unintelligible at first, but rising steadily into a chaotic cacophony that filled the room. My hands flew to my ears, but it did little to block the noise. It wasn't coming from outside. It was inside my head. Elliot shouted something, but his words were drowned out by the sound. He took another step forward, holding the bell aloft like a shield, and the creature recoiled slightly, its form flickering more violently as if struggling to maintain its shape. The whispers reached a fever pitch, and the chime's tone changed, higher, sharper, almost desperate. Then, just as suddenly as it began, the noise stopped. The room fell into an oppressive silence, broken only by the sound of my own ragged breathing. The creature was gone, leaving behind only the faintest trace of its presence, a dark, icy sensation that lingered in the air. Elliot lowered the bell slowly, his shoulders relaxing slightly as he turned to face me. "It's tied to this house," he said, his voice steady despite the tension etched into his features. "We forced it back for now, but it's not gone. Not entirely." I nodded, swallowing hard as I tried to collect myself. "What's next?" I asked, though part of me dreaded the answer. "We need to finish this," he said simply, his gaze shifting to the open doorway and the dark hallway beyond. "If we leave it like this, it'll keep growing stronger." The thought sent a fresh wave of unease through me, but I knew he was right. Whatever power the chime held, it was far from dormant. It was a call, a beacon, and something had answered. The question was whether we had the strength or the knowledge to send it back for good. We moved cautiously back into the hallway, the echoes of our footsteps seeming unnaturally loud in the heavy silence. The Duvals had retreated outside, and the house felt emptier now, its shadows deeper and more menacing. Every creak of the floorboards, every faint gust of wind through the broken window panes, set my nerves on edge. Elliot led the way to the staircase, his flashlight cutting a narrow path through the darkness. "We need to return to the basement," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. I hesitated, glancing back toward the front door. The thought of stepping outside, of breathing fresh air and leaving the oppressive weight of the house behind, was almost too tempting to resist. But something in Elliot's demeanor, his unshakable focus, his absolute certainty, compelled me to follow. The descent into the basement was like stepping into another world, one where time and reality seemed to twist and distort. The walls felt closer than before, the narrow stairwell pressing in on us like the throat of some monstrous creature. I gripped the railing tightly, my fingers brushing against the cold, damp wood. When we reached the bottom, the air was heavy with an almost electrical charge. The symbols on the walls seemed to glisten faintly in the beam of Elliot's flashlight, their jagged edges catching the light in a way that made them appear alive. The pedestal in the center of the room was empty now, the burlap-wrapped bell having been removed, but the space around it seemed charged with an invisible energy. Elliot stepped forward, his flashlight sweeping across the room. "It's strongest here," he murmured, more to himself than to me. "This is the heart of it." I stayed close to him, my own flashlight trembling slightly in my hand. "Do we destroy the bell?" I asked, though I already suspected the answer. Elliot shook his head. "It's not that simple. The bell isn't just an artifact. It's a conduit. Destroying it won't close the door. It might even make things worse." "Then what do we do?" My voice wavered despite my best efforts to keep it steady. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he set the bell down on the pedestal, its weight causing the stone to groan faintly. "We send it back," he said finally, his eyes narrowing as he began to study the symbols on the walls. I watched as he worked, his movements precise and deliberate. He traced the carvings with his fingers, murmuring under his breath as though piecing together a long-forgotten puzzle. The light from his flashlight caught the faintest hint of a smile as he found what he was looking for. A series of interconnected symbols that formed a circular pattern around the room. "This is it," he said, turning to face me. "This is how we seal it." Before I could respond, the chime rang out once more. This time, it was louder than ever, its tone sharp and commanding. The air in the room seemed to shift, growing colder and denser as the shadows around us began to move. My flashlight flickered and died, plunging us into near darkness. Elliot didn't hesitate. He began speaking, his voice firm and clear as he recited words I didn't recognize, their rhythm and cadence almost hypnotic. The symbols on the walls began to glow faintly, their light pulsing in time with his words. The chime rang again, but this time it seemed to falter, its tone uneven as if struggling against the forces at play. The shadows coalesced into shapes once more, their forms flickering like flames. They surged toward us, but the glowing symbols held them at bay, forming a barrier that they couldn't breach. I stepped closer to Elliot, my heart pounding as I watched him continue the ritual with unwavering focus. The chime rang one final time, a piercing note that seemed to shake the very foundation of the house. The shadows froze, their forms flickering and dissolving into nothingness as the light from the symbols flared brightly and then faded. For a moment, there was only silence. The oppressive weight in the air lifted, replaced by a stillness that felt almost peaceful. Elliot lowered his hands, his shoulders sagging slightly as the tension drained from his body. He turned to me, his expression weary but triumphant. "It's done," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. The suffocating quiet of Harrington House enveloped us once more as Elliot and I ascended from the basement, leaving behind the faintly glowing symbols and the oppressive sense of something restrained but far from vanquished. The floorboards groaned beneath our weight, the sound exaggerated by the stillness of the house, and I became acutely aware of every breath, every footstep. It was as though the air itself was holding its breath, waiting for what was to come. Elliot led the way, his frame as steady as ever, though I knew the tension in his shoulders too well to mistake it for ease. His hat brim cast a shadow over his face, but I caught the flicker of resolve in his eyes when he glanced back at me. The bell dangled at his side, its unnatural weight palpable even from where I stood. "You felt it too, didn't you?" I said, breaking the silence. My voice sounded foreign in the oppressive hush of the house. He didn't respond immediately. Instead, he paused at the threshold to the main hallway, his gaze sweeping the space. "It's restless," he said finally. "We disrupted it, but whatever's tied to the chime, it's not gone." I nodded, my throat tight. There were no reassurances to be found here, only the cold realization that we'd forced a confrontation with something we could barely comprehend. The Duval family was gathered in the living room when we arrived. Mrs. Duval's arms were wrapped protectively around her daughter, the little girl's wide eyes darting to the shadows that clung to the edges of the room. Her brother stood stiffly by the fireplace, his jaw set in an effort to mask his fear, while Mr. Duval paced like a man on the verge of breaking. "Is it over?" Mr. Duval demanded as soon as he saw us. His voice was sharp, but the underlying tremor betrayed his desperation. Elliot shook his head. "Not yet, but we're closer." Mrs. Duval's grip on her daughter tightened, and the girl whimpered softly. "You said you would help us," she said, her voice cracking. "You said you would stop this." "And we will," Elliot replied firmly. "But I need you to trust us. Stay together, stay in the light, and don't leave this room." The girl buried her face in her mother's shoulder, while her brother muttered something under his breath that I couldn't catch. Mr. Duval's pacing stopped abruptly, and he turned to Elliot, his expression both fearful and accusatory. "What do you mean, not yet? What else is there to do?" Elliot's gaze was steady, unwavering. "The chime is a key," he said. "It opens a door, and something came through. We need to close that door for good." "And how do you plan to do that?" Duval's voice rose slightly, his panic fraying the edges of his composure. "We need to draw it out," Elliot said simply. The room fell silent again, the weight of his words sinking into all of us. I could see the protest forming on Duval's lips, but he didn't speak it aloud. Perhaps he realized, as I did, that there was no alternative. Elliot turned to me, his expression unreadable. "I need you with me, Miguel," he said, and there was something in his tone that made it clear this wasn't a request. I nodded, though my stomach churned at the thought of what lay ahead. Always, we left the family huddled together in the dimly lit room and returned to the study. The space felt smaller now, the shadows more oppressive, and the faint scent of mildew that lingered in the air seemed stronger than before. Elliot placed the bell on the desk, its presence dominating the room in a way that was entirely disproportionate to its size. "We're going to call it here," he said, his eyes fixed on the bell. I swallowed hard. "And if it answers?" "It will," he said, his tone certain. "And when it does, we need to be ready." Elliot began arranging the objects on the desk with meticulous precision. The bell, Harrington's journal, and a small, worn notebook he'd pulled from his coat pocket. I watched as he flipped through the notebook, its pages filled with sketches, notes, and symbols, fragments of his years of research into the occult and the unexplained. "What do you need me to do?" I asked, steeling myself. He looked up briefly, his expression thoughtful. "You'll know when the time comes." The cryptic response didn't sit well with me, but I trusted Elliot. I had to. He began to speak, his voice low and deliberate as he recited words that felt ancient, their syllables heavy with meaning I couldn't fully grasp. The air in the room grew colder, the shadows on the walls deepening and stretching unnaturally. The bell remained motionless, but the faintest hint of a chime echoed through the room, so soft it was almost imperceptible. Then the whispers began. They were faint at first, like the rustle of leaves in the wind, but they grew steadily louder, each voice distinct yet blending into a cacophony that made my skin crawl. The light from the desk lamp flickered, casting the room into a strobe-like haze of light and shadow. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck rise, and my hand instinctively moved to the crucifix I wore beneath my shirt. Elliot continued to speak, his voice unwavering despite the growing tension in the room. The chime rang again, louder this time, its tone sharp and piercing. The shadows seemed to writhe and coalesce, forming shapes that were almost human but not quite. My breath hitched as one of the shapes turned toward me, its hollow eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. "Elliot," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "It's here." "I know," he replied, his gaze fixed on the bell. "Keep your focus, Miguel." The shadows moved closer, their forms shifting and flickering like smoke caught in a breeze. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and I could feel their weight pressing against my mind, probing for cracks in my resolve. I clenched my fists, forcing myself to stand my ground despite the primal urge to run. Elliot reached out and touched the bell, and the sound that erupted from it was deafening. The chime's tone was no longer a single note. It was a chorus, a symphony of discordant melodies that seemed to tear at the fabric of reality itself. The shadows recoiled, their forms flickering violently, and I saw something else. A figure, taller and darker than the rest, emerging from the heart of the chaos. The figure moved with a deliberate grace, its hollow eyes fixed on the bell. It radiated a presence that was both mesmerizing and horrifying, and I found myself unable to look away. The whispers ceased, replaced by a deep, resonant voice that echoed in my mind rather than my ears. "You cannot unmake what has been done," it said, its tone both mocking and final. Elliot stepped forward, his jaw set with determination. "We can try," he said, raising his hand over the bell. The figure laughed, a sound that sent a chill racing down my spine. "You are but fleeting shadows in a world that is not yours to command." Elliot didn't respond. He began to speak again, his words a steady chant that filled the room with a strange, almost palpable energy. The symbols on the desk and walls began to glow faintly, their light pulsing in time with his voice. The figure advanced, its form shifting and twisting as it moved. I stepped forward, instinctively placing myself between it and Elliot, though I felt woefully unprepared to face whatever it was. My heart raced as it raised a shadowy hand, its fingers elongating into sharp points that reached toward me. Then, with a final, resounding chime, the bell shattered. The room was plunged into silence, the oppressive weight lifting as the figure dissolved into nothingness. The light from the desk lamp stabilized, and I realized I was on my knees, my breathing ragged. Elliot stood over the shattered remains of the bell, his expression unreadable. "It's done," he said quietly. The air in Harrington House felt unnaturally still, as though the world had briefly stopped breathing after the shattering of the bell. For a moment I hoped, that it was over, that the oppressive grip of the house, with its malevolent shadows and whispers, had been broken at last. But hope has a way of twisting into dread when it lingers too long. I caught the flicker of doubt in Elliot's eyes as he stood over the fragments of the chime, his expression unreadable. I didn't want to speak. The words felt heavy in my throat, and the silence of the house pressed down on us both like a tangible weight. But the question came anyway, unbidden. "Is it gone?" Elliot's hand hovered over the shattered pieces of the bell, his fingers curling into a fist before he pulled them back. He didn't look at me as he answered. "No." That single word dropped like a stone into a deep, black well, rippling through the silence. My heart sank, and I found myself gripping the edge of the desk to steady the nausea rising in my stomach. "Then what did you?" "We stopped it from spreading," Elliot interrupted, his voice clipped. He finally looked at me, his gaze sharp and filled with something I couldn't quite name. Regret? Frustration? Fear? But the breach is still there. This wasn't the end. It was barely the beginning. My legs felt weak, and I sank into the chair behind me, the worn fabric scratching against my hands as I gripped the armrests. "So what now?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to hear the answer. Elliot straightened, the resolve that had defined him in so many moments before settling back into his posture. "We go deeper." I stared at him, incredulous. "Deeper? You mean into the basement? Or worse?" "Not just the basement," he said, pacing slowly, his eyes scanning the symbols etched into the walls. "The connection this house has to whatever's on the other side. It's still active. It wasn't just the bell. That was only part of it. There's something else here. Something bigger." Before I could respond, a faint noise caught my attention. At first, I thought it was the wind brushing against the old windows, but as it grew louder, I realized it was something far more sinister. It was the whispers, low and garbled, like voices murmuring underwater. The sounds seemed to come from everywhere at once, wrapping around us and pulling the air from the room. Elliot's movements stilled, his focus shifting immediately to the doorway. "It's starting again," he said, his voice low and measured. "Miguel, we don't have much time." The shadows that had once retreated into the corners now seemed to bleed into the open spaces, seeping out like ink spreading across a page. I stood shakily, my legs protesting as I moved closer to Elliot. "What do we do?" He turned to me, his expression a mix of determination and urgency. "Follow me." We left the study and stepped into the hallway, the wooden floorboards creaking beneath us. The house seemed darker than before, as if the light itself had grown afraid to linger within its walls. The whispers grew louder, and I could feel the weight of the unseen pressing against my skin, like cold fingers trailing over my arms and neck. I tried to focus on Elliot, his steady presence the only thing keeping my fear from consuming me. He led me back toward the staircase, but instead of descending into the basement, he turned toward the left, where a small, narrow doorway I hadn't noticed before stood ajar. The light from his flashlight illuminated the space beyond, revealing a set of steep, crumbling stone stairs that spiraled downward into the darkness. "This wasn't on the floor plans," I said, my voice barely audible over the pounding of my heart. "Of course it wasn't," Elliot replied, his tone almost wry despite the circumstances. "Harrington didn't want anyone finding this." I hesitated, the oppressive atmosphere of the house gnawing at my resolve. "And you think we'll find answers down there?" He glanced back at me, his expression grim. "We'll find something." With that, he began the descent, and I followed, my grip on the banister tightening as the stairs grew narrower and more treacherous with each step. The air grew colder as we went deeper, the faint scent of damp earth mingling with something acrid and metallic that made my stomach churn. The space at the bottom of the stairs was unlike anything I'd seen before. The walls were lined with strange carvings, more intricate and alien than the ones in the basement. Symbols I didn't recognize glowed faintly, their edges shimmering with an unnatural light. At the center of the chamber stood an altar, its surface slick and dark, as though it had been recently doused in oil. The air felt heavy, almost viscous, and my breathing grew shallow as I stepped closer. Elliot approached the altar cautiously, his flashlight beam dancing over the strange markings that covered its surface. "This is it," he murmured, more to himself than to me. "This is the source." I didn't need to ask what he meant. The energy in the room was palpable, an oppressive force that seemed to pulse in time with the whispers that surrounded us. The shadows on the walls writhed and shifted, taking on shapes that were almost human but not quite. I felt a chill race down my spine as one of the shapes turned toward me, its hollow eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. Elliot's voice broke through my thoughts. "Miguel, stay focused." I nodded, though my hands were trembling. "What do we do?" I asked again, my voice tinged with desperation. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached into his coat and pulled out a small, leather-bound book. Flipping through its pages quickly, he found what he was looking for and began to speak. The words were foreign, their syllables harsh and guttural, and they seemed to hang in the air like smoke, lingering long after they were spoken. The room reacted almost immediately. The glowing symbols on the walls flared brightly, casting the chamber into stark relief. The shadows recoiled, their forms flickering violently as though they were being burned. The whispers rose to a deafening roar, and I clapped my hands over my ears, though it did little to block the sound. The altar began to tremble, and a crack appeared on its surface, spreading outward like a spider's web. The energy in the room surged, and I felt myself being pushed backward, the force of it overwhelming. I stumbled, catching myself against the wall as the room seemed to shudder around me. Elliot's voice grew louder, more insistent, and the shadows began to dissolve, their forms disintegrating into nothingness. The altar split apart with a loud, bone-rattling crack, and a wave of cold air rushed through the chamber, extinguishing the glowing symbols and plunging us into darkness. I fumbled for my flashlight, my hands shaking as I switched it on. The beam illuminated the chamber, now silent and still. The altar was reduced to rubble, its fragments scattered across the floor. The oppressive energy that had filled the space was gone, leaving only a hollow emptiness in its wake. Elliot turned to me, his expression weary but resolute. "It's over," he said quietly. I wanted to believe him, but the unease in my chest told me otherwise. The silence was deafening as Elliot and I emerged from the depths beneath Harrington House. My flashlight cast faint beams over the gouged walls, now devoid of the glowing symbols that had illuminated our descent. The fragments of the altar were scattered across the floor, broken shards reduced to dull stones. And yet the oppressive sensation, that lingering weight pressing down on the chest, remained. It clung to the walls and air like the residue of a fire. Elliot glanced back at me, his silhouette tall and steady against the dim light that seeped through the stairwell above. "It wasn't enough," he muttered, though his voice carried less frustration than resignation. I leaned against the jagged wall, my hands trembling as I tried to catch my breath. My head was still spinning from the confrontation, no, the breach we'd just witnessed. Whatever force had risen from the shattered bell and the altar felt vast, unknowable. "You don't have to convince me," I said, my voice quieter than I'd intended. "I can still feel it watching." He nodded slightly, then turned back toward the staircase. "The Duvals," he said with quiet urgency. "We need to make sure they're safe." We ascended quickly, the sound of our footsteps echoing against the narrow stone stairwell. As we climbed higher, the air grew heavier again, suffused with an unnatural chill that seemed to cut deeper than the cold of winter. I gripped the railing tightly, my knuckles white against the worn wood, and tried to ignore the sensation that something was brushing against me, just outside the periphery of my vision. When we reached the top, the main hallway stretched out before us, engulfed in a blackness broken only by the flickering light of the front room's lamp. I felt my pulse quicken as I noticed the shadows writhe along the walls, their movements subtle but deliberate. Elliot paused, his hand resting lightly on the doorframe, his body tense as he scanned the room beyond. The Duvals were still huddled together in the living room, their faces pale and etched with fear. The youngest clung tightly to her mother's arm, her wide eyes darting toward every corner and crevice of the room as though expecting something to crawl out. Her brother stood rigid by the window, the tension in his frame almost audible, while Mr. Duval paced relentlessly near the fireplace, muttering to himself. "You're still here," Elliot said as he stepped into the room, his voice calm but commanding. "Good." Mr. Duval turned sharply toward him, his features tightening with frustration. "Where else would we go?" he snapped, his voice cracking under the weight of fear. "You said staying put was safer, and it still is," Elliot interrupted, his tone measured but firm. He gestured toward the flickering lamp. "Stay in the light and keep this room as your center. The house isn't safe to move through right now." Mrs. Duval's grip tightened on her daughter, whose wide eyes welled with tears. The older boy muttered something under his breath, his gaze fixed on the darkness beyond the window. Elliot's attention lingered on him briefly before turning back to Mr. Duval. "Anything change?" he asked, his voice sharp. Mr. Duval hesitated, his gaze shifting toward the hallway before shaking his head. "The whispers, they come and go. Nothing else. At least, not yet." Elliot nodded, his lips tightening as though the answer confirmed his suspicions. He glanced at me briefly before stepping closer to the flickering lamp on the side table. He adjusted its wick, the flame steadier now, casting longer but stronger shadows across the room's worn wallpaper. "Do not let this go out," he said to the family, his voice lower now. I moved closer to Elliot, my own hands shaking as I gestured toward the lingering shadows creeping along the edges of the room. "They're gathering," I murmured, my voice hoarse. "The breach, it's still widening." He met my gaze for only a moment, his expression unreadable. Then he turned to the family again. "Stay here. No matter what you hear, no matter what you see, don't move from this spot." And with that, we left them. The hallway seemed longer than before, as though the house itself had warped and shifted around us. The blackness beyond the reach of our flashlights was almost liquid, twisting and pooling into unnatural shapes. My breath grew shallow, my pulse loud in my ears, as the faint whispers began again. They seemed closer now, wrapping around us like invisible coils. I clutched the strap of my satchel tightly, the leather biting into my palm as I followed Elliot toward the staircase. "Where now?" I asked, my voice strained. "Back to the basement," he replied without hesitation. "There's something we missed." I didn't question him, though every step we took felt heavier than the last. The sense of dread deepened as we descended, the air thickening around us like syrup. My flashlight wavered slightly in my grip, the beam cutting through the darkness but unable to dispel the shadows fully. When we reached the bottom, the chamber was silent but not still. The broken altar remained in the center, its fragments scattered like the remnants of a shattered mirror. But it was the walls that drew my attention now. They were alive. The carvings etched into the stone were no longer dormant. Their jagged edges pulsed faintly with an unnatural light that seemed to move like veins beneath the surface. The glow was rhythmic, almost like breathing, and I could feel its resonance deep in my chest. Elliot stepped forward, his flashlight sweeping over the symbols as his jaw tightened. "They're reacting," he murmured, his voice quiet but firm. "Reacting to what?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted the answer. He didn't respond immediately, his focus shifting toward a particularly large symbol near the far corner of the chamber. It was different from the others, more intricate, its edges sharper, and its glow brighter. He reached out, his hand hovering over its surface, and the light flared brightly for a moment before dimming again. "It's a passage," he said finally, his tone heavy. I stared at him, my mind racing. "A passage to what?" "The other side," he replied. The words hung in the air, their weight sinking into my chest like lead. I glanced back toward the shadows that clung to the edges of the room, their movements growing more deliberate. "We can't. We have to," Elliot interrupted, his voice firm but not unkind. He turned to face me fully, his gaze steady. "This is the only way to close the breach." I swallowed hard, my hands trembling as I nodded reluctantly. "What do we do?" Elliot reached into his coat and retrieved the leather-bound book again. He flipped through its pages quickly, finding the passage he sought, and began to speak. The words were harsh and guttural, their syllables sharp and cutting. The glow from the symbols grew brighter, and the chamber began to tremble slightly, the stones beneath our feet shifting. The shadows recoiled at first, their forms flickering violently against the walls. But as Elliot continued to speak, they began to advance again, their movements faster and more deliberate. I stepped closer to him instinctively, my pulse pounding as I gripped my flashlight tightly. The largest symbol on the far wall flared brightly, its glow almost blinding, and a low, guttural sound filled the chamber. It wasn't the whispers, not anymore. It was something deeper, more primal. The ground beneath us trembled, and the broken fragments of the altar seemed to move slightly, as though drawn toward the symbol. Elliot's voice grew louder, more insistent, and the shadows surged forward, their forms stretching and twisting unnaturally. I felt the chill of their presence against my skin, their touch icy and invasive. But just as they reached the edges of the glowing symbols, the light flared brightly once more, and the shadows dissolved into nothingness. The chamber fell silent again, the glow from the symbols fading completely. Elliot lowered the book slowly, his shoulders sagging slightly as he took a deep breath. "It's closed," he said quietly. I nodded, though the unease in my chest refused to leave. Somehow I knew this wasn't the end. The sound of silence in Harrington House was far from comforting. It wasn't the stillness of peace. It was something holding its breath, a tension coiled so tightly that it threatened to snap. The glow of the carvings on the basement walls had faded, leaving only cold stone and dust. Elliot stood near the shattered remnants of the altar, his hands on his hips, his brow furrowed deeply as if trying to wrestle some invisible answer from the air around us. I leaned against the damp wall, my flashlight heavy in my hand, the faint beam jittering across the fragmented floor. My lungs burned with exhaustion and fear, but there was something deeper now, a weight that I couldn't shake, a feeling that we hadn't severed the root of the malevolence that lived in the house. Whatever it was still here, and it knew we were too. Elliot broke the quiet, his voice low and resolute. "This isn't over, Miguel." "Yeah," I replied, pushing off the wall and shaking off the fog of my thoughts. My voice sounded hollow to my ears. "It's still watching us, isn't it?" His blue-gray eyes flickered toward the ruined altar and then back to me. "Not just watching, waiting." The word hit me like ice water. Waiting for what? I didn't ask, though I could feel the unspoken question hanging between us. I knew Elliot well enough by now to recognize the restless energy coursing through him. The pieces of the puzzle were almost in place, but something critical eluded him. He began moving again, his flashlight arcing across the chamber as his boots crunched against loose stones. "That symbol on the wall," he said, pointing to the intricate design that had burned so brightly before extinguishing itself. "It's a doorway." I nodded, though unease knotted my gut. "And we closed it, or tried to." "We sealed the edges," Elliot corrected, stepping closer to examine the wall. His tone betrayed no comfort. "But the connection runs deeper than this chamber. We've been chasing echoes. The heart of it, whatever's feeding this, is still open." A flicker of movement caught my attention, and I swung my flashlight toward the far corner of the room. A shadow too dense, too intentional to be the product of our own lights flickered briefly before dissipating. My breath caught, and my pulse quickened. "You saw that, didn't you?" I asked, my voice trembling despite myself. Elliot didn't look at me, but he nodded. "They're closer now." The words sent shivers coursing through me, but I pressed on, forcing myself to focus on the task at hand. If we didn't close the breach completely, then how do we find the source? The real source? Elliot took a step back from the wall, his expression hardening. "The house itself is the source." He gestured around us, his voice tightening. "This chamber, the basement, the altar, it's all part of it." Harrington thought he was summoning something external, but what he really did was awaken the house. And the chime was its voice. The logic of his words hit me like a blow. It explained the layers of malice that seemed woven into every creak of wood, every breath of cold air within Harrington House. The walls, the floors, the very foundation. It wasn't just haunted. It was alive, sentient in a way that defied reason. "And if the house is alive," I began, trailing off as my mind filled with the implications, "then we have to kill it." Elliot finished bluntly. His voice carried a weight that made the task feel both impossible and inevitable. The words hung in the air between us. For a long moment, neither of us moved, our gazes fixed on the fractured altar as though it might offer some form of dissent or guidance. The idea of killing a house sounded absurd, even as every fiber of my being knew it to be true. The house wasn't just alive, it was hunting us. Elliot turned sharply, his boots crunching against the rubble as he began to ascend the staircase. "We need fire," he said simply, his voice cutting through the thick air like a blade. "What?" I asked, stumbling to keep up with him. "You mean burning the house down?" He didn't stop, didn't look back as he replied. "The structure itself is a conduit. Burning it won't destroy the connection, but it might sever it long enough to end this." The practicality of his explanation did little to quell the dread pooling in my stomach. "And what if it doesn't work?" He paused at the top of the stairs, turning to face me fully. His expression was calm but unyielding, and for the first time that night, I saw a flicker of vulnerability in his eyes. "Then at least we tried." That was the thing about Elliot Brooks. He never promised success, never dangled false hope. His strength lay in his resolve, his willingness to step into the unknown even when the odds were stacked against him. And somehow I found myself following him yet again. The upstairs hallways were darker than before, the flickering light from the living room struggling to reach beyond its immediate vicinity. The shadows along the walls pulsed faintly, their movements deliberate and unsettling. The whispers had grown louder, though they lacked the fevered chaos of earlier. They were more rhythmic now, almost like a chant. When we reached the living room, the Duvall's faces turned toward us with expressions that teetered on the edge of panic and hope. Mr. Duvall rose from his place by the fireplace, his hands trembling as he wrung them together. "Did you fix it?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Elliot shook his head. "Not yet." Mrs. Duvall gasped softly, clutching her children closer to her side. The little girl buried her face in her mother's shoulder, her small frame trembling visibly. Her brother stood rigid and pale, his knuckles white as he gripped the arm of the sofa. Mr. Duvall's voice cracked as he spoke again, the desperation in his tone impossible to miss. What are you going to do?" Elliot met his gaze evenly. "We're going to stop it, but you need to get out of the house." Mr. Duvall opened his mouth to protest, but Mrs. Duvall cut him off, her voice firm despite the tears in her eyes. "Do what he says. Take the children outside." The man hesitated only a moment longer before nodding, his movements jerky and uncertain. He gathered his family quickly, his arm around his wife as she clutched their children tightly. They hesitated at the door, their eyes lingering on us briefly before stepping out into the cold night. Elliot moved to the fireplace, pulling a length of wood from the flames and holding it like a torch. The firelight danced across his features, casting sharp shadows that made him look both resolute and haunted. "Start with the upstairs," he said, his voice steady. "We'll work our way down." I hesitated, the enormity of what we were about to do sinking in fully. The house creaked around us, the sound almost like a groan of protest, and I forced myself to move, grabbing another piece of burning wood from the hearth. The first room we entered was empty save for the cobwebs and dust that had accumulated over decades. Elliot moved with purpose, tossing the torch into a pile of rotted furniture in the corner. The flames caught quickly, consuming the brittle wood and sending thick smoke curling toward the ceiling. We worked quickly, moving from room to room, setting fire to whatever would burn. The house groaned louder with each torch we left behind, the floorboards beneath us shuddering faintly as though the structure itself was fighting back. The whispers grew louder, their chant now a roar, and I felt the walls tremble as we descended once more toward the ground floor. By the time we reached the living room, the house was alive with flames. The heat was oppressive, the smoke choking, but the whispers had begun to falter, their rhythm broken and chaotic. I could feel the shift in the air, the energy of the house fracturing and splintering as the fire consumed it. Elliot stood in the center of the room, his face illuminated by the flickering flames. He turned to me, his expression unreadable but fierce. "It's done," he said simply. But even as the words left his lips, I knew the house wasn't going down without a fight. Flames roared through Harrington House, the heat pulsing in waves so intense that it felt as though the air itself were screaming. The fire consumed everything in its path. Timber beams cracked like gunshots, and plumes of smoke curled upward, escaping through shattered windows. Outside, the Duval family stood in the frigid night, their faces lit by the eerie glow of the inferno. They clung to one another, their silhouettes trembling against the backdrop of chaos. Elliot and I were still inside. "Move!" Elliot's voice cut through the cacophony, a commanding force that urged me forward. The walls shuddered as if the house were alive and writhing in its death throes. Shadows flickered and twisted within the blaze, their unnatural forms defying the flames that sought to consume them. The air was thick with smoke, making it difficult to see more than a few feet ahead. The floorboards beneath us groaned ominously as we raced through the hallway, our path illuminated by the wavering glow of firelight. The house wasn't letting us leave, not without a fight. From the corner of my vision, I caught a flicker of movement. A shadow, a tall, angular figure that shouldn't have been there, stepped out from the wall, its hollow eyes glowing faintly through the haze. It moved with a deliberate grace, its elongated limbs stretching toward us like skeletal branches. "Elliot!" I shouted, my voice hoarse from the smoke. He spun to face it, his sharp eyes narrowing as he raised the flashlight still clutched in his hand. The beam of light cut through the smoky gloom, momentarily disorienting the figure. It recoiled, its form flickering violently, but it didn't disappear. The shadows surrounding it seemed to ripple and surge, drawn to its presence like moths to a flame. "This house doesn't want to let go," Elliot muttered, his voice steady even as the heat grew unbearable. "It's fighting for its life. Then we tear it apart," I said, though the words felt hollow even as I spoke them. Another tremor shook the house, and debris rained down from above. A jagged piece of timber splintered and fell, narrowly missing us as we stumbled through the collapsing hallway. The sound of cracking wood and roaring fire was deafening, but beneath it all, I could still hear the whispers, faint and insidious, like a dying breath that refused to fade. We reached the staircase, now partially engulfed in flames. The banister had collapsed, leaving jagged, charred remnants jutting out like broken teeth. Elliot didn't hesitate, leaping onto the remaining steps with a precision I could only envy. I followed closely, wincing as the heat seared my skin and the soles of my shoes threatened to stick to the smoldering wood. When we reached the ground floor, the inferno's full scope came into view. The fire had spread with terrifying speed, devouring the walls and furniture in a frenzy of destruction. But even amidst the chaos, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, that the house itself was staring at us with a malevolent hunger. "Elliot," I said, my voice trembling, "do you feel that?" "I do," he replied grimly, his gaze sweeping the room. "It's not done with us yet." As if in response, the whispers grew louder, their dissonant chorus filling the air. The shadows coalesced once more, gathering in the center of the room to form a single towering figure. It was larger than any we'd seen before, its presence suffocating, its form shifting and flickering like a fire given shape. Its hollow gaze fixed on us, and the air grew colder despite the inferno raging around it. Elliot stepped forward, his jaw clenched, his flashlight aimed directly at the creature. "This ends now," he said, his voice like steel. The figure raised an elongated arm, its jagged fingers outstretched, and the temperature dropped further. Frost formed on the edges of the burning walls, the flames hissing and sputtering as though fighting against the encroaching cold. My breath came in short, panicked gasps as I felt the air itself grow thinner, suffocating. Elliot didn't falter. He reached into his coat and pulled out Harrington's journal, its pages now singed and crumbling at the edges. Flipping quickly to the passage he'd marked earlier, he began to read aloud, his voice cutting through the whispers with a force that seemed to ripple through the air. The entity writhed, its form flickering violently as though Elliot's words were searing it. The shadows that surrounded it began to dissolve, their jagged edges melting into the floor. But the figure held its ground, its hollow eyes burning brighter, defiant. I realized then that Elliot's words alone wouldn't be enough. The house was alive, aware, and it wouldn't surrender to us without a final price. "We need to finish this," I shouted, grabbing a nearby piece of burning wood from the floor. "We have to destroy it completely." Elliot glanced at me, his jaw tightening, and he gave a sharp nod. "Do it." With every ounce of strength I had left, I hurled the burning wood into the heart of the entity. The flames surged as they made contact, engulfing the figure in a blinding explosion of light and heat. The whispers rose to a deafening crescendo, their chaotic chorus filling the room as the shadows writhed and twisted in agony. The entity let out a final guttural cry, a sound that seemed to shake the very foundation of the house before it dissolved into nothingness. The flames roared higher, consuming everything in their path, and the walls began to collapse around us. "Run!" Elliot shouted, grabbing my arm and pulling me toward the front door. We sprinted through the crumbling house, dodging falling debris and leaping over burning wreckage. The heat was unbearable, the smoke choking, but the light of the open doorway loomed ahead like a beacon. With a final burst of energy, we burst through the door and into the cold night air, collapsing onto the frozen ground. Behind us, Harrington House was fully engulfed in flames. The structure groaned and buckled, its walls collapsing inward as the fire consumed it from within. The whispers were gone now, replaced by the crackling of burning wood and the distant howl of the wind. Elliot sat beside me, his breath coming in short, labored bursts. His face was streaked with soot, his coat singed, but his eyes held the glint of triumph. "It's done," he said quietly, his voice steady despite the chaos around us. "The house is dead." I stared at the burning wreckage, my chest heaving as I tried to process everything we'd just endured. The firelight cast long shadows across the snow, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw something move, a faint flicker at the edge of the flames. But then it was gone, and I told myself it was only my imagination. The Duvals were huddled nearby, their faces pale but alive. Mrs. Duval held her children tightly, her gaze fixed on the fire, while Mr. Duval stared at us with a mix of gratitude and disbelief. As the last of Harrington House collapsed into ashes, a strange stillness settled over the scene. The air felt lighter, freer, as though a great weight had been lifted. And yet, in the back of my mind, a lingering doubt remained, a faint echo of the house's malevolence that refused to fully fade. Elliot rose to his feet, brushing off the snow that clung to his coat. He turned to me, his expression weary but resolute. "Come on, Miguel," he said. "We've got a long night ahead." I nodded, standing shakily and following him toward the waiting car. Behind us, the fire continued to burn, its embers glowing like distant stars against the darkened sky.